Hi, I hope this counts as keeping my promise to say something about Sartre today. This, in keeping with the lateness of the hour, will be a relatively short video presentation, but hopefully with sufficient content to get this off the ground. So, Sartre, of course, might be one of the few people that you would have heard of or even perhaps prior to coming to this course, if not in philosophy, perhaps in fiction or theater, a very important figure in the mid 20th century intellectual world, the philosophical doctrine that he was not exactly the founder of, but the 20th century version is probably most closely associated with Sartre, existentialism. And the work that you read and the contribution to moral theory that we're going to take up is very much an existentialist conception of moral judgment. And I just want to say a little bit about what motivates that view, how Sartre gets to this view, and about what that view is, maybe affinities and differences with you. All right. Sartre is one of these philosophers whose view of moral value kind of comes out of this very big, fundamental, metaphysical picture of the world generally. And for Sartre, the metaphysical distinction that's at the heart, not just of his philosophy, but on his view of all things, is this. There's the world of facts, what he calls the world of the in itself, and then there is the world of the sort of choosing agent, the self, the agent that makes its way through the world through intentionality. And this Sartre calls the for itself. And this metaphysical distinction, essentially, between things on one hand and choosing minds on the other, is crucial to the worldview and the picture of value that comes out of that worldview. Now, I think Sartre starts in a very powerful and plausible place where he draws our attention to the way in which the world of facts, even social facts, in this sense, his conception of facts is richer than Hume's. Sartre will talk about social facts and constructed facts as still very much part of the world of facts that do not, on his view, determine the content of what the choosing self, what the intentional self goes on to make the case, to make so. So to give an example that I think is good for Sartre, it's a mistake to see your upbringing or religious identity as a justification for why you act one way or another. The Catholic woman, the neighbor of Sartre, who says, I cannot get an abortion, I am Catholic, this is Sartre's own example, makes a metaphysical mistake on Sartre's view. It is not the fact that you are Catholic that is doing the justificatory work. It's the fact that you choose to make your Catholicism count for you. This, I think, is, and we could run this example or different versions of this example a million different ways. It's not the facts. It's your decision to make those facts count in a particular way that does the explanatory work. It's not that my father has a business that I'm going into it, or, well, I was born Jewish and that's why I have to go to Israel. No, it's never the facts that do the explanations. It's the decision to count those facts one way rather than another. This is the beginning of existentialist thought. Don't try to hive off your responsibility onto the world as if it's a fact, as if it's just something that could not be altered. He calls this actually a distinctive kind of inauthenticity, bad faith. If we don't, upon reflection, acknowledge that our lives and our choices are fundamentally just the product of our choices, not the factual circumstances we're born into. That's the beginning of existential authenticity on Sartre's view. And suitably modified, I think there's something very powerful in that point. It's a mistake, which I take to be essentially this. It's a mistake to see the justifications we offered as the recitation of facts in the world. And I think that's a hard insight to resist. Now, somehow, and when we're done with the overall view, we can go back and try and speculate as to how or why Sartre connects this point with another. And that's the point that's most crucial to us, because it's a point about, as was the case with Hume, how to understand moral predicates. That's the point. What's the philosophical interpretation of the right, the vicious, whatever? Well, on Sartre's view, congruent with what I've just said about justifications not being facts in the world we could somehow detect, but are instead the free, uncoerced choice of a free, unfettered self to align itself with one set of facts or another. So Sartre thinks that moral goodness or rightness must be understood along these lines too, that no state of affairs factually described can be said to have rightness or non-rightness or wrongness or non-wrongness in it. It's the free, unfettered endorsement or affirmation of a course of action as right that makes it so. This is the famous example of the young boy deciding, or in a quandary, because he is in France in the early 1940s and he's contemplating joining the resistance. In some versions of the story, perhaps his brother has already died in the resistance, so this places a certain kind of constraint on his choice, since this would break his mother's heart to lose both her children. And on the other hand, he could stay in his village and take care of his aging mother who needs his care. And the boy allegedly asks Sartre, when he's, touring France and himself a member of the resistance in a modest way. So this boy asks Sartre, so what's the right thing to do? What's the right thing to do? To which Sartre says, you must choose, meaning not just that it doesn't matter what I tell you, you have to make a choice, but that he actually is saying it is in the choosing that the quality of rightness or the predicate of rightness comes to be true. Neither of these courses of action is right or not right, but if you endorse one as yours, then it becomes so. That's the theory. And I don't know how long we'll stay on this today, but before I go, I want to introduce, this is something of a very meaningful digression, a context in which this extremely wild and implausible account of meaning and truth can be true. And this is in a context that we call in philosophy a performative. Performatives are statements which become true if, and just in case, they are uttered, they are said in the right circumstances. If there's the right performance, then it's so. It's often students sometimes do and sometimes do not guess examples of this. Unfortunately, I can't solicit your ideas on this one this time, but an easy case is something like a promise. Only if you, and you see this in marriage, only when you say, I do, are you then indeed married. In the absence of the performance of the statement, it's just not the case. Promises, when you say, and this is identical to a signature in a contract, and say, I hereby promise to repay this debt, then it becomes true that you have this liability. Absent the performance, it is not so. A very powerful case, there are others, but here's one that we'll stay with on for a while. Consider something like knighthood. What is it, or damehood, if it's a woman, what is it that makes someone a knight? Is it their intelligence, their bravery, their imaginativeness, their service to the British Empire? None of these guarantee knighthood. None of these are a sufficient condition. nor are they a necessary condition. The queen could, and in Shakespeare plays, sometimes the king has, knight an absolute buffoon. What makes someone a knight? Nothing about knights. There's no quality that anyone who is a knight must have. There's no quality that anyone who is a knight must not miss. What makes someone a knight is simply that the queen has pronounced that person a knight. That's what it is. If the ceremony has been performed, then Sir Toby Belch from Twelfth Night is a knight. And if the ceremony is not performed, then, uh, anyone fails to be a knight. Then, John Gielgud or Laurence Olivier failed to be knights because the ceremony was not performed. The most talented person in Britain might not be a knight if the queen doesn't knight him. And the most common one can be if the queen does. Knighthood resides solely in the performance, in the act, in the gesture. Well, Sartre doesn't say this, but I've often thought this is a very profitable analogy for what he does say. That for Sartre, it's almost as if each of us is like the sovereign with respect to our subjects, and we baptize the ones we wish to find good as good. And there's no goodness in the world without the baptism. There is goodness so long as there is that endorsement, baptism. So before getting into, what we might find odd or puzzling about this, let me just point out some affinities and some very big differences with Hume. Like Hume, Sartre rejects the idea that goodness can be construed as some kind of fact. And as that French example, the French Catholic woman resisting ever having an abortion example is supposed to show, Sartre will include in the world of facts things like a religion or a national identity or who your father is and all this stuff that we wouldn't think of as in the world of physics, the way the world of facts seems to be for Hume. But even so, as expansive as the factual is for Sartre, like Hume, he would say, evaluative claims cannot be thought of as anything like the detection and the recitation of factual claims. No. But unlike Hume, for Sartre, it's not then some caused reaction rooted in our biological nature, like color or taste or the sense of beauty. No, with Sartre, it's an unfettered, unconstrained choice of a wholly free self, like that of the queen before her subjects with respect to the bestowal of knighthood. And that's what Sartre is telling this guy when he says, just choose, because it's almost like he's accusing him of an error. Are you suggesting that there's rightness in the course of action as such, and you've got to find it the way if I give you two sacks, you can find which is heavier? Is that how you think of rightness? That's the mistake. It's to be understood as a performative. Well, I'm sure a lot of you are scratching your head or scratching your chins with puzzlement and incredulity, and rightly so. I will mention just two kinds of difficulties, and then this is just an intro, and we'll take this all up again in another video very shortly. The first difficulty, I think, is very obvious, and you might want to say, is Sartre really saying that so long as I freely align myself with something, it becomes good, and it really could be something really wrong, like racism or apartheid or something like that? How could my free endorsement of those policies make them anything but what they are? That's one kind of problem, the problem of what you might call the idea of the reversal of moral values problem. Is it really the case that there is no difficulty in applying Sartre's analysis to anything, however initially wrong or awful it seems? It's very hard even to describe this example because if Sartre were here, he would say, Professor Ross, you're begging the question. You can't call these things wrong or bad, and my analysis then inverts the values. There is no wrong or bad apart from the performative, so there's no perversion possible, etc. I mean, obviously, that's a cogent rejoinder. I'm appealing to a kind of pre-existentialist intuition that certain things really are bad or wrong, quite apart from whatever anyone chooses or fails to choose. And that's an intuition that we're going to see fleshed out very shortly when we turn to the next group of philosophers like Mill and Kant and Aristotle. But leaving that aside, whether or not there's any non-circular way to make out that argument that an analysis like Sartre's would call evil things good, there's very closely related to it a problem that kind of intrigues me more, and that is this. How does Sartre avoid what you might call the trivialization problem? Why, if it's really the case that there's nothing in the factual world constraining our use of the term right or good, why not have as our, if this were true, it would make sense if we applied it to things like counting buttons or looking at clouds. Why aren't these candidates for this endorsement as well? If there's nothing about the world of facts that separates out some facts from others as worthy of moral judgment, you see the earlier point about if your view of goodness is too abstract, you will wind up in this embarrassing position of having to make sense of applying the term to things that are not in any way suitable candidates. So I don't think it makes any sense at all to say, which is right, staying home with mom, joining the resistance, or counting buttons. How does counting buttons get to be a candidate for this when it has absolutely no connection to anything like anybody's welfare or reasonable expectations or reciprocity in love or any of these things? It's quite absurd to think that it really is like a performative that could equally easily adhere to any set of facts, like paint. You might think of it that way. You have a paint on your brush, you can put it on any surface. There's nothing about any surface, whether it's wood or steel or paper or cloth, that precludes you putting it on. There's nothing about any surface that requires you put it on. The being painted red predicate is purely a function of what you decide to put your brush on. And that's how Sartre sees it. And if you really do see it that way, how can you resist or avoid the embarrassing example I'm bringing up here? I'm not talking about finding apartheid good. I'm talking about finding, like I say, counting buttons good, or blades of grass. Why aren't these candidates for this performative analysis? If he really believed what he is saying here, he should prove it by giving us those sorts of examples. But of course, the example he gives is just the opposite. It's an example where each of the two choices is, in fact, chock full of morally relevant considerations: fighting against injustice, the Nazi occupation, doing your part for your nation on one hand, which is tied to, justified feelings of gratitude and love for this entity that you were born into and raised. And on the other hand is this mother who presumably you love and has loved you for years and is facing a very anxious future if you go away. Why would we for a moment not see these things as hard to choose between, not because there is no moral value in the world, but because in this case, each of these is sort of just saturated with different kinds of morally relevant considerations? And Sartre takes their rough equivalence, I should say, to indicate there's nothing on the scale. But to me, it's the other way. The equivalence is the result of there being 100 pounds on each balance of the scale. But the main point for today is that while I think Sartre is quite right to point out the ways in which justification stories are never identical to the recitation of our fact circumstances, I think that's a very strong point. I don't think he has a plausible view of what goodness is or rightness and how we are to understand it. I think a performative analysis can't possibly be right here. And why he goes from one to the other is an interesting question. I'll offer some speculations about it. They're not really things you have to know in this course, but roughly, I think it's because he's in the grip of an unfortunately crude dualism, the one with which we began, between the world of facts and the world of choice. So when it's not clearly part of the factual world, he has to think of it as like the way you might on a whim choose between two pairs of shoes, where there's just absolutely no sense whatsoever in which you're responding to considerations. He just doesn't have that. The same way Hume doesn't have social construction, Sartre just thinks of all intentionality as unfettered choice rather than responding to considerations that you don't make, but you are responding rather than not. In any event, again, the big contrast is Hume is a naturalist. He would think that we would just have very deep instincts one way rather than another in these cases. And those instincts are telling you where your, strongest convictions lie. That would be that. It's not the non-factual nature of morality arises from our biology. Whereas for Sartre, it is this unfettered choice. Another example that might help, I was going to save it for another time, but some people have this view of art. If you go to the galleries in Chelsea, and if you look at a lot of this modern art, it can seem so silly and foolish and strange. And you look at, this urinal of Duchamp, or you look at just this bicycle wheel and splotches on paper, or, an empty space. And you think, okay, so what is it in virtue of which all this different stuff, some of it seemingly junk, can all be called art? And you're driven, some are, this is actually a well-known and famous theory, the institutional theory of art, you're driven to a performative analysis. And artists often like this analysis where, oh, I'll tell you what makes something a work of art. The gallery owner says so, or the critic says so, or the people who are buying say so. That's all. If the right people say it, it's true. And if they don't say it, it's not true. There's a version of this performative theory in the kind of tough, hard-bitten, cynical, seen it all before Joe version of the art world. And you can see how it goes. Yeah, sure. Why is this stuff here? Is it any good? What a dumb question. It's just something the gallery owner or the critic happened to approve of. That's all. It's just their approval that makes it art. If you get their approval, you're an artist. And if you don't, you can't say you are. That's the comparable view. But as this is kind of a nice example, I'm glad I brought it up. But if you really believe that there is no factual constraint on the predicate is a work of art, then you're going to illustrate it with exactly these wild examples. You'll say it'll be part of your pride in your theory. You'll say, look at this urinal, look at this splotch, look at this bed, look at this big fan. This is art? This could only be art if art were just what the gallery owner says. Well, if Sartre really had the parallel view, he'd have to embrace, in fact, promulgate the counting buttons example. He'd have to say, yes, 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 there's nothing in the world that makes it so. Consider counting buttons or looking at the clouds, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, that paragraph was left out of the final edition. There's just no plausible way to make that account out. All right, I'm going to stop it here. Please ruminate on this and write me with any questions, and then we'll have a Zoom class. Thanks.